Wren Callahan spent 3 years reading The Duke's Twilight Vow, instead of sleeping, dating, or answering her mother's calls about grandchildren. She had a favorite side character, a job that was eating her spine one vertebra at a time, and exactly zero interest in romance, fictional or otherwise. Then she fell asleep at her desk during a client deadline, and woke up in a canopy bed the size of her old studio apartment, 9 months pregnant, wearing a wedding ring, and lying next to Damian Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, the coldest, most devastatingly handsome love interest in the entire novel. Welcome to Flustered novel, where love is chaotic, confessions are awkward, and every story comes with butterflies, drama, and a little emotional damage. Grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's dive into today's romance story. For the record, I did not ask to be here. I want that on file somewhere, in whatever cosmic filing cabinet handles complaints from people who get yanked out of their own lives without so much as a customer satisfaction survey. I was 29 years old, I had a job in claims processing that required me to apologize to strangers for a living, and I had just pulled my third consecutive all-nighter finishing a report that nobody, including my boss, would ever actually read. My reward for this heroic feat of endurance was a granola bar I found in my desk drawer that expired 8 months earlier, and I ate it anyway, because at 3 a.m. self-respect is the first thing to go. At some point between paragraph 4 of the Hendricks Quarterly and the sun beginning to threaten the horizon, I put my head down on my keyboard, just to rest my eyes, and I must have typed several hundred symbols into an empty subject line, and I fell asleep to the gentle glow of my monitor, and the sound of the office fridge humming its one mournful note. The last thing I remember thinking, with the clarity of a woman who has read the same 600,000-word fantasy romance novel more times than she has seen her own family, was, I would honestly rather be anyone else right now. Even Seraphina. And Seraphina dies on page 412. I want to be very clear that this was a joke. An exhausted, sleep-deprived, mostly rhetorical joke, the kind you make to the ceiling of your cubicle when you have given up on being taken seriously by the universe. The universe, as it turns out, does not understand rhetorical. I woke up warm. That was the first wrong thing. My apartment in December was never warm. My radiator worked on a strict need-to-know basis and mostly decided it did not need to know. I woke up warm and soft, buried under a blanket that had the density and quality of a small sheep, in a bed that did not creak, in a room that smelled like beeswax candles and cedar instead of instant noodles and printer toner. The second wrong thing was the weight in my stomach. Not sick wrong. Round wrong. Present wrong. In the way that made me freeze entirely before I even opened my eyes, both hands sliding down on instinct to confirm what my body was insisting was true and my brain was refusing to file. The third wrong thing, the thing that turned my quiet internal screaming into the kind you do out loud, was the man breathing evenly beside me, one arm thrown with proprietary confidence across a body that was very pregnant, entirely unfamiliar, and as I would spend the rest of this story discovering, currently mine. I knew that jawline. I had described that jawline several times, in the margins of a paperback I owned in 2 languages. I had become the mother of the male lead's twins overnight, and nobody had thought to warn me that overnight was doing a tremendous amount of narrative heavy lifting. This is the story of how I got out of that bed, and everything I broke, faked, negotiated, and fell in love with on the way. Here is what I knew about Damian Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, before I woke up next to him. He was tall in the specific, structurally excessive way that authors use when they want you to feel small on purpose. He had eyes the color of a storm deciding whether to ruin your picnic. He did not smile so much as allow the corners of his mouth to acknowledge an idea. He had buried one fiancé, exiled one brother, and made exactly one woman, Duchess Seraphina, cry so hard in chapter 6 that I had to put the book down and eat an entire sleeve of crackers to cope. He was, in short, the kind of man who existed to be swooned over by readers with significantly more patience for emotionally unavailable aristocrats than I had ever possessed. I liked him the way you like a thunderstorm from inside a well-built house. I had never once, not for a single sentence, wanted to be in the house with a thunderstorm. And yet, I lay very still, doing the frantic mental math that anyone would do upon waking up pregnant next to a stranger who was, technically, a fictional stranger, which is somehow worse. My hands were not my hands. They were pale and soft in a way that suggested a life free of spreadsheets, with a wedding band on the left one that caught the gray morning light coming through a window taller than my old apartment door. My hair, when a lock of it fell into my eye view, was a deep auburn instead of the practical brown I had been born with. I was, near as I could tell without a mirror, and without alerting the extremely large man currently using me as a pillow rest, inhabiting the body of Duchess Seraphina Voss on the exact morning she was scheduled, according to a novel I had read 4 times, to go into labor with twins she would not survive. I want to be honest about my priorities in that moment, because I think they say something flattering about my instinct for self-preservation. I did not think how romantic. I am living my favorite book. I thought, with the crisp, professional panic of someone who has read the terms and conditions, I have read this contract, and the maternal mortality clause is not one I am willing to accept. The arm across my middle tightened. A voice low and rough with sleep said, "You're awake early." I have negotiated insurance claims with furious strangers at 7 in the morning. I have talked a man out of suing our company over a squirrel-related roof incident. None of that prepared me for turning my head on a pillow that smelled like cedar, and finding Damian Voss's storm gray eyes 6 inches from my face, half-lidded, entirely unbothered by the fact that his wife had apparently not blinked in several minutes. I said, which felt like a safe, non-committal sound to make while my soul attempted to leave through the ceiling. He studied me the way he studied ledgers, according to Chapter 2, like there might be a discrepancy hiding in the numbers. "You look pale." "I feel," I said, choosing my words with the care of a woman defusing a bomb she had built herself, unusually aware of being alive. Something that was almost amusement crossed his face and was immediately arrested, filed and denied, the way I imagined he handled most emotions, small and large. The midwife said the last weeks would be uncomfortable. I did the math again. Last weeks. As in the very last of them. As in contractions were, structurally, imminent, possibly by lunch, and I had approximately zero practical experience with childbirth beyond a single alarming video in 10th grade health class that had put me off soup for a week. I said, with what I hoped sounded like ducal serenity, and was actually the tone of a woman requesting an emergency bathroom break in a job interview. A moment. Alone. To collect myself. Damian Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, terror of 3 provinces, looked at his 9 months pregnant wife like she had suggested something faintly insulting. "You've had 8 months to collect yourself." "And yet," I said, swinging my unfamiliar, enormous, entirely borrowed body toward the edge of the bed with the grace of a capsized ship. "Here I am collecting further." He did not stop me. He did, notably, watch me the entire way to the door, with the focused, faintly suspicious attention of a man who had just noticed his wife's shoulders were speaking a slightly different dialect of body language than the one he was used to. I made a note, filed under things I will need to fix immediately. He was paying attention. He was always, I would learn, paying attention. It was going to make lying to him spectacularly difficult, and it was going to be, in ways I could not yet see, the most interesting problem of my life. The mirror in Duchess Seraphina's dressing room was the first honest thing I encountered that morning. It showed me a woman with my new auburn hair scraped into a braid some very patient person must have done the night before. Cheekbones sharper than mine had ever been, and an expression of pure, unfiltered horror that belonged entirely to me. Some things apparently transferred. "Your Grace." A young woman appeared at my elbow so quietly I nearly levitated. She had kind eyes, flour-dusted forearms, and the particular posture of someone bracing for bad news. "You rang for me sooner than usual." I had not, in fact, rung for anyone. My hand had apparently done it out of some muscle memory that belonged to a woman who was not currently home. I decided, in the 2 seconds available to me, that honesty was a luxury I could not yet afford, and improvisation was the only currency I had. "I did," I said. "I find I am not entirely myself this morning." This turned out to be the single most accurate sentence I would speak for the next several months, and also, delightfully, the one nobody questioned, because who argues with a pregnant duchess about her own state of mind? The young woman, Nettie, I would learn, and thank every god available that she was kind, because Nettie would end up doing more to keep me alive in that castle than anyone else in it. Helped me into a robe the approximate weight of a car door and asked, with the careful neutrality of staff who have learned not to editorialize, whether I wanted breakfast sent up, or whether I intended to face the Dowager Duchess at table. I had read about the Dowager Duchess. I had, in fact, dog-eared the page on which she informed her grandson's fiancé that ambition without lineage was a mongrel wearing a crown. A line so viciously good I had texted it to my sister with 4 exclamation points. Facing her in person, while pregnant, while an imposter, felt like walking directly into weather. "Breakfast up," I said. "I would like to keep my strength for later confrontations." Nettie's mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile before she remembered herself. "Why's your grace?" While she laid out a tray of things I did not recognize by smell alone, I did the only useful thing available to me. I inventoried. I had read this book. I knew, roughly, the shape of the plot, though 3 years and one very demanding job had softened some of the specifics into a fog. I knew the twins were coming today, possibly within hours. I knew that in the original text, Seraphina's death in childbirth was the hinge the entire third act swung on. It was the tragedy that finally cracked open Damian's frozen heart. 300 pages too late for the wife who'd earned it. I knew he would grieve her with the specific, devastating restraint of a man who had never learned how to grieve anything out loud, and that he would raise the twins with the help of a governess and a slowly unclenching soul, and that he would eventually, 400 pages later, fall in love with someone else entirely. A spirited merchant's daughter named Josephine who existed, as far as I could tell, specifically so the fans had someone to root for. I did not intend to die so that some merchant's daughter could inherit my thunderstorm. This was not, I want to be clear, about romance. Not yet. At that point in the morning it was pure, practical self-preservation. I had one body currently on loan, and I was going to keep it running as long as humanly, or Duchess Ly possible. If that meant surviving childbirth against the express wishes of the narrative, I intended to do it with the same stubborn, spreadsheet-honed competence that had gotten me through 4 years of processing other people's disasters for a living. Nettie, I said, around a mouthful of something that turned out to be a spiced pear that I would, over the following months, become genuinely unwell about. Where does one find a physician in this house who isn't a midwife who's already decided how this ends? Nettie blinked. Your Grace. I want a second opinion, I said. On my own survival. Humor me. She did not understand the joke, because she did not know it was one. But she nodded, filed it away as one more strange new thing about her mistress that morning, and went to fetch someone, and I sat in a borrowed body in a borrowed room, eating a pear that tasted like it had never once been refrigerated, and began in the privacy of my own skull, to plan. The contractions started at 2 in the afternoon, with the kind of rude, undeniable punctuality I had come to associate with everything in this new life. I had spent the intervening hours attempting to glean as much practical information as I could without revealing that I did not, technically, know how to be either a duchess or a mother, and I had learned 3 things. The physician Nettie found agreed to attend alongside the midwife, purely because I insisted, in a tone that brooked no further discussion, that I wanted options. The Duke had been informed and had gone very quiet in the way Nettie described as concerning for him though. You'd have to know him to see it. And I was apparently, thought to be acting strangely enough that 2 separate maids had already commented on it within my hearing. I would love to tell you that I handled labor with grace. I did not. I handled labor the way I handle most physical pain, which is with a great deal of narration, most of it profane, some of it in a language none of the staff recognized because it was in fact, English, and we were not, technically, anywhere near England. You are doing wonderfully, Your Grace, the midwife said, at one point, in the tone of a woman who says this to everyone regardless of accuracy. I am doing, I informed her through my teeth, the single hardest thing I have ever attempted, including the year I trained for a half marathon and then did not run it. Damian Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, terror of 3 provinces, paced outside that door for 11 hours. I know this because Nettie told me afterward, with something like wonder, that he had refused food, refused a chair, and had at one point, according to a very nervous footman, put his fist through a support beam in the east hallway hard enough to require repair. This was not a man in the original text who did that. This was not the frozen, controlled Damian Voss I had read 4 times. Something, apparently, had already shifted, and it had shifted before I'd done anything at all except survive the morning. At 11 that night, in a room lit by too many candles and full of more blood and shouting than I will describe in detail, because some things are simply not romantic no matter how you frame them, I became, overnight, in the most literal sense available to the English language, the mother of twins. They put the first one in my arms before I had even fully processed that I had survived, and something in my chest, some organ I did not know I still had after 3 years of processing insurance claims for a living, simply came undone. She was small and furious and had a full head of black hair, and she screamed at the room with the specific, personal outrage of someone who had been perfectly comfortable where she was and deeply resented the change. I loved her immediately, entirely, without permission from my own common sense, which had up to that point, been running the show. Rosalind, I said because it was the name Seraphina had chosen in the book, and because looking at her tiny furious face, no other name would have fit. The second one they placed on my chest a few minutes later was quieter, watchful, with eyes that were already, impossibly, the same storm gray as his father's. He did not cry so much as observe the room with deep, personal suspicion, as though filing a report on its shortcomings. Theodore, I said, and felt something in my chest crack fully open, the last hinge giving way. Well, hello both of you. I did not expect to like you this much this fast. The door opened. Damian Voss stood in it, hair disheveled, cravat long abandoned, knuckles wrapped in a hasty bandage that told its own story about the support beam. He looked at me, alive, upright, holding two furious, screaming reasons he no longer had to grieve his wife, with an expression I did not have a reference for in any chapter one had read, because the book had never gotten to write it. Nobody had ever described Damian Voss looking relieved, because in 412 pages, he had never once had reason to. "You're alive," he said, in the voice of a man testing whether a fact was load-bearing. "Overachieving as usual," I said, entirely too tired to filter myself, and rocked my furious, beloved, entirely unplanned daughter against my chest. "Come meet your children, Your Grace. They've been very patient with me and deserve an audience." He crossed the room like a man walking into weather he had never been trained for, and knelt by the bed, and looked at his son and daughter with an expression that cracked something open in him too, right there, 300 pages earlier than the book had ever planned. Nobody warns you, in any version of this story, fictional or otherwise, that surviving childbirth is merely the entrance exam. The actual test begins immediately afterward and does not, as far as I could tell in those first weeks, include a lunch break. Rosalind cried when she was hungry, which was often, and when she was tired, which was constant, and occasionally, I became convinced, purely for the sport of it, to test whether the household's structural integrity could withstand her at full volume. Theodore, by contrast, rarely cried, which I initially took as a blessing until I realized it meant he simply watched everything with a silent, judgmental patience that somehow felt worse. I would catch him staring at me across the nursery at 3 in the morning. This tiny gray-eyed creature evaluating my performance as a parent with the quiet menace of a man auditing my expense reports. And I would say out loud to an infant, "I am doing my best, Theodore, and I would like that noted in the file." Nettie, God bless her steady hands and her infinite patience for a duchess who apparently did not know how to swaddle an infant despite having, according to everyone around me, given birth to one before, taught me everything with the gentle diplomacy of someone breaking in a new employee without embarrassing them in front of the rest of the office. "You hold him a bit higher, Your Grace, just there, mind his head," she'd say, and I would think, not for the first time, that Nettie deserved a raise, a vacation, and possibly a medal, none of which were within my power to grant, though I made a private vow to fix that the moment I had any actual authority in this house. Damian Voss, to my considerable surprise, did not disappear into his study the way I had expected a fictional duke of his particular emotional architecture to do. He appeared in the nursery at odd hours, ostensibly to review correspondence, in a chair by the window, though I noticed he reviewed remarkably little correspondence and watched his children with remarkably total attention. The first time Theodore fell asleep on his father's chest, one tiny fist curled into the Duke's shirt, Damian sat entirely motionless for 40 minutes rather than risk waking him. And when I came in to find them like that, I had to leave the room quickly and pretend I needed something from the hallway, because whatever was happening in my own chest at that sight was not something I was prepared to examine with witnesses present. "You're staring," he said, without opening his eyes, the second time it happened. "I'm assessing," I said. "It's different from staring. Assessing has a purpose." "And your assessment?" I considered lying, the way I had been lying, carefully and constantly, about nearly everything since I'd woken up in this life. "You're better at this than the reputation suggests." Something crossed his face, quick and unguarded before he caught it. "The reputation suggests very little of value." "The reputation," I said, settling into the chair across from him with the specific exhaustion of a woman running on 90 minutes of broken sleep, "suggests you once made a diplomat cry during a trade negotiation by asking a single question." He was embezzling from his own delegation. The question was fair. I'm not disputing that it was fair. I'm saying it's not the same man currently sitting very still, so as not to wake up a baby who drooled on his second best coat. He looked down at Theodore. And then involuntarily, something that was almost a real smile made it past whatever internal committee usually vetoed such things. "He has excellent taste in coats, apparently." I laughed before I could stop myself, too loud for the sleeping infant, who startled, scowled without waking and settled again, and Damian Voss looked at me. Not at the wife he thought he'd married, not at the woman from 400 pages he'd never really known, but at me, at whoever I actually was underneath all this borrowed silk, with an expression I was beginning, despite every instinct telling me not to look forward to seeing again. By the time the twins were 6 months old, I had developed what I privately called my survival curriculum, 400 years too early for the term but entirely accurate to the concept. A rotating set of strategies for surviving court functions, staff politics, and the ever-present, low-grade dread of someone eventually noticing that the Duchess of Ashcombe had, apparently, developed an entirely new personality overnight, and had also forgotten, briefly and catastrophically, how to curtsy. "You're doing the thing again," Nettie murmured to me at a spring gathering, under her breath, as I stood frozen at the top of a receiving line while my brain scrambled to remember whether Baron Whitmore outranked Countess Aldrich or the reverse. "I am absolutely not doing a thing," I said, smiling with the fixed brightness of a woman defusing a very small, very well-dressed bomb. "You are. You go still, and your eyes move like you're reading something only you can see." She was infuriatingly correct. I had taken to mentally flipping through what remained of my memory of the source material, whenever I hit a social situation I hadn't yet improvised my way through. And it was apparently visible from the outside, which was a problem I filed immediately under things to fix before someone with actual political motive notices. The someone with actual political motive arrived roughly a month later, in the form of the Dowager Duchess Constance, Damian's grandmother, a woman who moved through rooms the way a cold front moves through a valley, and who had, according to every source I trusted in that household, never once approved of anyone. "You've changed," she said to me, without preamble, over tea I had not asked to attend and could not politely refuse. She said it the way other people might announce a change in the weather, or a death. "Motherhood changes people," I said, which was true generically, and told her nothing. "It has changed you specifically," she said, watching me over the rim of her cup with eyes the same storm gray as her grandson's, into someone who laughs at dinner, who asks the servants their opinions, who once, I am reliably informed, thanked a stable boy for holding a door. She said this last part the way another woman might describe a scandal involving livestock. "I was raised to believe good manners extend below the salt," I said, borrowing a phrase I'd heard a maid use and hoping it landed as period appropriate rather than deeply, transparently improvised. The Dowager Duchess studied me for a long moment, long enough that I became genuinely afraid she had, somehow, in some grandmotherly sixth sense, detected the precise shape of the fraud sitting across from her with a teacup in her borrowed hands. Then she said unexpectedly, "My grandson has not smiled this much since he was younger than your children are now." I did not know what to do with that information except hold very still. The way you hold still around something wild that might either approach or bolt. "I don't know what happened to you," the Dowager Duchess said, setting down her cup with the finality of a woman closing a file. "And I have decided, for reasons I do not fully understand and resent slightly, not to investigate it. Whatever you are now, keep being it." She rose, smoothing her skirts, already moving toward the next item on whatever agenda Dowager Duchesses kept. "Though do learn to curtsy properly. You've been doing it wrong for 6 months. And it's beginning to embarrass the household." I did not run out of that tea room, because duchesses, I had learned, do not run. I performed what I privately termed a strategic retreat, at a brisk and dignified walk, directly to the nursery, where I sat down on the floor between my son and daughter, and laughed until Nettie came to check I hadn't finally, fully lost my mind. The twins turned one with the kind of chaos I imagine most parents recognize and most novels skip entirely, because novels, I was learning, are deeply uninterested in the 11 consecutive nights of teething, the specific betrayal of a nursemaid's afternoon off coinciding exactly with Rosalind's discovery that she could climb, or the truly heroic effort it took to keep Theodore from feeding an entire bowl of stewed plums to the household's least food-motivated hunting dog purely, as far as I could tell, out of scientific curiosity. Damian, over that year, had become someone I no longer recognized from the book, and I want to be careful here because I don't mean that as a criticism of the original. I mean that the man in those 412 pages had never been given room to be anything other than magnificent and frozen, a mountain range of a person, beautiful and unreachable and ultimately, tragic. The man who crouched on the nursery floor at 6 in the morning, hair rumpled, sleeves rolled, trying and failing to convince his daughter that porridge was an acceptable breakfast while she flung a spoon across the room with the accuracy of a small, furious catapult, was not tragic at all. He was ridiculous, in the specific way that only someone you love is allowed to be ridiculous. And I found increasingly that I did not want to be anywhere else in the mornings except in that room, watching him lose an argument with a 1-year-old. "She's testing me," he said, with the grave seriousness of a man discussing border negotiations, retrieving the spoon. "She's succeeding," I said unhelpfully from the doorway, cradling a cup of something warm and bitter that passed for coffee in this century. "You've lost this round entirely." "I have not lost. I am regrouping." "Your Grace, you are on the floor. She is standing on your knee. There is porridge in your hair." He looked up at me from the floor, porridge in his hair exactly as reported, And something in his face. Some wall I had watched him maintain since the morning I woke up next to him. A wall I had, admittedly, spent a year quietly, patiently, without ever quite naming it to myself, chipping at, simply wasn't there anymore. I have decided, he said, that I would rather lose to her 1,000 times than win at anything else. I did not have a response to that. I stood in the doorway with my bitter, warm drink and felt something enormous and unplanned settle into place in my chest. The way a key settles into a lock it was cut for. It was around this time, roughly 14 months after I had woken up as someone else's wife in someone else's life, that I began keeping a second, private mental list, distinct from my survival curriculum, distinct from my ongoing catalog of things to fix. I began keeping a list of things I did not want to lose. Should the universe ever decide to return me to my cubicle and my expired granola bar and my old, smaller, quieter life. Rosalind's furious, delighted shriek when she successfully stole food off someone else's plate. Theodore's silent, deeply suspicious evaluation of every new person who entered a room, which I had come to find, against all reason, adorable rather than unsettling. Nettie's dry commentary, delivered always just under her breath. The Dowager Duchess's grudging, weaponized approval. And Damian on the nursery floor, losing to a 1-year-old, and calling it the best kind of defeat. Damian in doorways at odd hours, watching his children with an attention he had never, in 412 pages, been given permission to show anyone. Damian looking at me the way he had started to look at me somewhere in that year, not like a math problem anymore, not like a discrepancy in a ledger, but like an answer he had not expected and did not entirely trust himself to have found. I did not know, yet, whether I was allowed to want to stay. I only knew that the list kept getting longer, and that I had stopped, somewhere in that year of teething and porridge and stolen spoons, checking the door for an exit. Every story, apparently, insists on a complication. And mine arrived at the twins' second birthday celebration in the elegant, entitled shape of Lady Ophelia Winters, a woman I recognized instantly from 400 pages of increasingly desperate scheming, and who had, in the book, spent several chapters attempting to install herself as Damian's second wife on the theory that the first one was conveniently, tragically dead. The first one was notably standing right there, holding a slice of cake and an increasingly wary expression. "Your Grace," Lady Ophelia said to me, with a smile so precisely calibrated to appear warm that I nearly applauded the craftsmanship. "How wonderful that you're still with us. One does worry, after such a difficult birth." "One's worry is very touching," I said, matching her smile tooth for tooth, though largely unnecessary at this point, given the 2 years that have since elapsed. Her eyes flicked, briefly, unmistakably, toward Damian, who was across the garden attempting to prevent Theodore from feeding cake to the same long-suffering hunting dog who had, apparently, never learned to say no to these children. "The Duke looks well. Fatherhood suits him." A pause precisely timed. "It's remarkable, really, how much warmer he's become. Almost unrecognizable from the man I once knew." I understood in that moment, with the crystal clarity of someone who has read the relevant chapters, exactly what Lady Ophelia was doing. Laying groundwork, quietly, patiently, for a future in which the current Duchess had, through misfortune or mismanagement, become unavailable, and a familiar, convenient replacement stood ready. It was, I had to admit, professionally impressive. It was also, I decided on the spot, not going to work because I had spent 2 years becoming someone this family actually needed, and I was not interested in vacating the position for a woman whose personality, on the page, had consisted entirely of scheming and a truly excellent wardrobe. "He's always been warm," I said pleasantly, "to people who deserve it. I imagine that's remained consistent." Something flickered across her composure, quick and unpolished, gone before most people would have caught it. I caught it, because I had spent a year learning to read micro-expressions on a man far better at hiding his than she was. "I only mean," she said, recovering smoothly, "that a woman in your position must think of the future. Children need stability. Should anything ever happen." "Lady Ophelia." I set down my own slice of cake with the deliberate care of a woman setting down a weapon she has decided not to use, yet. "I am going to save us both a great deal of time. I know precisely what you are doing. I have decided, with equal precision, that it will not succeed. Not because I am cruel, or because I don't understand ambition. I understand it rather better than you'd think. But because those 2 children currently attempting to feed cake to a dog have a mother, and she intends to remain extremely, tediously, robustly alive for as long as it is within her power to arrange." She stared at me for a long moment, recalibrating, the way I imagined she'd once recalibrated her entire strategy on the page, chapter after chapter. always one step behind a man she'd never actually understood. "You're different than I expected," she said finally, and there was something almost like respect buried under the venom. "Everyone keeps telling me that," I said. "I've started taking it as a compliment." She left not long after, with the particular dignity of someone retreating to regroup rather than surrender, and I did not doubt I would see her again in some future chapter of this life. But I walked back across the garden toward my husband and my children, and the increasingly cake-covered dog with the loose, settled feeling of a woman who has just successfully defended something she had, at some point without quite noticing, decided was hers to defend. "You look pleased with yourself," Damian said, handing me a squirming, frosting-covered Rosalind, who immediately transferred a significant quantity of that frosting to my sleeve. "I had a productive conversation," I said. "With Lady Ophelia." It wasn't a question. He'd clearly clocked her the moment she arrived, the way he clocked everything. "With Lady Ophelia," I agreed. He studied me for a moment, the storm-gray eyes doing the thing they did when he was deciding whether to ask a question he already suspected the answer to. "Should I be concerned for her?" "Only if she tries that again," I said, and meant it, and watched something in his face settle quietly into a kind of relief he did not bother hiding from me anymore. It happened in the end, the way these things always seem to in retrospect. Quietly, on an unremarkable afternoon, nearly 3 years after I had woken up in a body and a life that were never supposed to be mine. I found the letter by accident, tucked into a book in Damian's study I had borrowed without asking. The kind of accident that only happens to people who have spent 3 years half expecting the other shoe to drop. It was addressed to him, and signed, and it detailed in clinical unemotional handwriting the precise means and timing by which the Duchess of Ashcombe had originally been scheduled to die. A fever 3 years prior, that should have taken her within a week of the twins' birth, arranged, I would later learn, by a rival house that had wanted Ashcombe's alliance without Ashcombe's wife attached to it. I had, without ever knowing it, been living inside a plot that had already tried, once, to kill the woman whose body I now occupied, and whoever had arranged it did not know, or believe, that the danger had passed. I told Damian everything that night. Not everything. I did not tell him about the cubicle, or the granola bar, or the book with 412 pages I had read as a much smaller, much more tired version of myself in a world he would never see and could never visit. But I told him about the letter, and the fever that never came, and the sense I'd carried for 3 years that I had, somehow, dodged something I was never meant to survive. He went very still, the way he did when something mattered too much for his face to process it quickly. "You've known you were in danger. For 3 years. I suspected. I corrected. Suspecting is different from knowing. I didn't want to alarm you over a feeling." Ren. It was the first time he had used the name I'd told him, months earlier, in the dark, half convinced he wouldn't believe me and mostly right. He'd taken it, in the end, as an endearment rather than a confession, a private nickname rather than the truth it actually was. "You will tell me these things. Immediately. Not 3 years later, over a letter you found by accident." "Noted," I said. "For the file." "I am not joking, Ren." And there it was again, the wall gone entirely. Nothing left between us but a man who had spent 3 years slowly, carefully, learning how to be afraid of losing something instead of simply expecting to. "I have already buried one version of you I never got the chance to know. I will not do it twice, over your instinct to handle everything alone. I want to tell you that the resolution of all this was dramatic, that we hunted down the rival house, that there was a confrontation in a rain-soaked courtyard, that I delivered a devastating monologue while lightning struck picturesquely behind me. The truth is duller and I think better." Damian spent the following weeks quietly, methodically dismantling the political leverage of the house responsible, with the same cold, precise competence the book had once used to make him frightening and now made him, simply, effective on my behalf. There was no more danger, in the end, not because of a dramatic confrontation, but because a man who loved his wife turned out to be considerably more thorough than the people who had once wanted her gone. I was supposed to die, I told him, one evening, months after the letter, watching the twins chase each other across the lawn with the specific, joyful violence of 3-year-olds who have discovered running. In the story I knew, I was supposed to die so you could grieve me properly and fall in love with someone else entirely. He was quiet for a moment, watching our children, his hand finding mine without either of us deciding it should. "I don't know what story you knew," he said finally. "I only know the one that happened. And in that one, you lived, and I have never once, since the night you did, wanted anyone else in the world." "That's disgustingly romantic," I said. "For a man who once made a diplomat cry over a single question." He was embezzling, Damian said, and I laughed, loud enough to startle the birds out of the hedge. Loud enough that Rosalind looked over, delighted, and ran to demand to know what was funny, and I scooped her up and did not, for one single second, miss the granola bar, or the cubicle, or the smaller, more tired life I had left behind without ever meaning to. 5 years, give or take a tantrum. The twins are 7 now, which means I have spent 7 years being their mother, and, if you count carefully, roughly 7 years and one very strange night being the Duchess of Ashcombe. And I can report, with the confidence of a woman who has now survived both childbirth and a rival house's assassination attempt, that the second job is considerably harder than the first, mostly because Theodore has recently developed an interest in interrogating every adult in the household about the exact legal definition of fair, and Rosalind has taken up fencing badly, with a stick, against anyone who will hold still. The Dowager Duchess still tells me I curtsy incorrectly. I have stopped correcting it out of pure, contented spite. Nettie is head of household staff now, a promotion I fought for with the same stubborn energy I once brought to a squirrel-related insurance claim, and she still, to this day, tells me when I am doing the thing, though the thing itself has changed. These days it means I've gone quiet thinking about a life half a world and a universe away, a life with a cubicle and a granola bar and a version of myself who fell asleep one exhausted night, and never woke up in her own bed again. I don't grieve her, exactly. I think, some nights, she'd be glad to know how this all turned out. I think she'd have wanted the thunderstorm, if she'd known she was allowed to. Lady Ophelia married a viscount 2 provinces over, and sends exactly one frostily polite letter a year, which I have taken to reading aloud to Damian at breakfast in a voice of increasing theatrical menace, purely because it makes him laugh, which is still, after 7 years, one of my favorite sounds in this or any other world. Damian Voss, Duke of Ashcombe, terror of 3 provinces, once famous for making grown diplomats weep with a single unblinking question, currently cannot win an argument with either of his children, has lost every negotiation involving bedtime since approximately year 2, and remains, by unanimous household vote, the single easiest mark in Ashcombe for anyone under the age of 8 requesting a later curfew, a second dessert, or a horse. You've ruined him, the Dowager Duchess informed me last week, watching her grandson lose again, to Rosalind's carefully deployed pout, over whether she was permitted a dog of her own to replace the long-retired, thoroughly cake-traumatized hunting hound. I've improved him, I said. There's a difference. He caught my eye across the garden as Rosalind claimed victory and declared, with tremendous solemnity, that the new dog would be named after her father. So he's here even when he's busy. And something in Damian's face did the thing it still does 3 years, 5 years, 7 years into a story I never asked to be part of and would not, now, trade for any version of the quiet, smaller life I left behind. Something opened, entirely, without permission from whatever committee used to run these things, and settled for good, exactly where it was always supposed to be. Thanks for spending time with Flustered novel. If this story made you laugh, blush, or scream at the characters, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and come back for more chaotic romance stories. See you in the next novel. I woke up pregnant next to a stranger, in a story I thought I already knew the ending to. I was wrong about the ending. I am on the whole delighted to report it.